Well, welcome to the Fine Gardening webinar on spring bulbs with our host, Joseph Tychonievich. It's great to see you, Joseph.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Joseph is how would you just, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. How would you describe what it is you do, Joseph?
I I always just the short answer is I write about gardening in various forms, a few books, some articles in fine gardening, and yeah, I do some stuff also sort of behind the scenes in the garden world, doing some editing for the Rock Garden Society's journal and stuff like that. But yeah, I like to communicate to people about how to grow cool plants.
And we were just talking before we went live about your comic book guide to growing food. So that sounds like
Yes.
a fun one. And I hadn't heard of that book before. So
Yeah, that's my most recent book. So it's a guide to vegetable gardening aimed at sort of total beginners in the form of a graphic novel, basically. So it's basically it follows there's one character who is a novice gardener and her neighbor is an expert gardener and he teaches her how to garden and along the way you learn how to garden. So it was really fun to do and kind of have a different approach to giving sort of those basics vegetable gardening information for people.
very cool. Today, we're going to be talking about one of your other passions, which is flowering bulbs. We like to shout out to Jung Seed for sponsoring, and I wanted to mention that Jung Seed actually carries a nice variety of spring flowering bulbs, so I encourage people to check out their website. We would love to have questions from the audience, and you can drop those into the chat. And we'll have Christine Alexander, who's our executive web producer, come on a little bit later, and she can share questions that we get live. But we did also get quite a few questions in advance of this. So we'll start with those, and those may help audience members to think of questions of their own. Um, I want to mention also that the video of this is being recorded, and we will have a video on the Fine Gardening website and our YouTube channel sometime after. It usually takes a few days, but if you're watching and you want to share this with family and friends who weren't able to join live, that is a possibility. Um, I'm just looking to make sure there are no other like opening things that we need to do, but I think we can just get right into the questions.
Yeah.
All right. First one, and this is someone who read your article in Fine Gardening's Fine Fall issue, which is out now. So they said in your article you mentioned many of the typical bulbs, but online stores also list other bulbs as spring bulbs. For example, foxtail lily, anemone, fritillary, and others. Are these true spring bulbs? So I think what maybe would be a good place to start is like, let's define what we're talking about.
Yeah, so I think when we're saying spring bulb, we're using bulb in the colloquial sense rather than the technical sense. It's a little bit like the are tomatoes a fruit or a vegetable debate. So there's like a technical definition of bulb, but we're going to use a more broad definition of what a botanist would call geophytes. So there's all kinds of plants that have underground storage organs that they store food in underground so they can wait out dry summers, cold winters, and then burst into growth in the spring and start flowering. So to a botanist, a bulb is only those ones where that structure is made out of leaves primarily. So the classic example is an onion. So when you're cutting an onion, those rings are the bases of the leaves that have food stored in them. And that little plate at the bottom where the roots come out is the stem. And most of it is leaf. So tulips and daffodils are true bulbs where they're made out of leaves, but things like crocuses are corms, and that's a stem. But for practical purposes to a gardener, they all do the same thing. It's a mass that the plant has stored food in that structure, and that gives it all the energy it needs to burst into growth and come into flower early in the spring. So when we're going to say bulbs throughout this, we're talking geophytes, and that may be tubers, rhizomes, tuberous roots, corms, bulbs, all these other things, that have the same structure and sort of the same purpose and performance in the garden.
Yeah, and the common theme is like we usually buy these when they're dormant, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean that's the so they these the structures evolve to survive usually dry conditions and cold winters. So the plants are going dormant and they're storing all their food in this little package, which makes it so convenient for us because we can buy them when they don't have leaves and they don't have roots and they're not going to dry out and it's very easy to ship them and plant them and they have all the food they need to then burst into growth. So that's this adaptation that they have to survive difficult periods makes it really convenient and easy for us to plant them in our gardens.
yeah, and it's like there's nothing like it for just adding color at a time of year when you don't see as much color from other things. Um, so uh, we had sort of a theme of questions about planting depth. Somebody said they have really rocky soil. Do I really need to plant 6 inches deep? Um, we've had questions about planting tips for small bulbs when you get, the bag of 200 tiny little crocus bulbs. It's like, do I really have to dig 200 tiny little holes? Can you give us sort of a general overview of like, why are they recommending, these deep planting depths, and are there tips to make planting easier?
So on planting depth, Um, that really matters most if you're at the edge of the hardiness zone for a bulb. So if you have a daffodil that's hardy to zone 4 and you're in zone 4, you really want to make sure you give it that full depth so it has insulation from the cold temperatures deeper in the soil. But for a lot of us, I'm in zone 6 and a lot of daffodils are zone 3 or 4. That is really not as critical because they're not going to be exposed to those intense levels of cold. And over a few years, the bulbs will move themselves into the soil to where they want to be. So I don't worry that much about planting depth, to be honest. You do want to plant them deep enough that they're not going to be drying out while they're growing, but unless you're planting right at the edge of something's hardiness zone, I kind of make sure that the bulb is buried in soil. And my go-to the easiest way to do planting is if you can get a team of 2 people. And I love to do that with larger bulbs. You can get a shovel. One person can put that shovel in the ground and just push it forward to lean open and make a gap in the ground. And then somebody else can be down, just drop a bulb in there. And then if you just lift that shovel up, the bulb will drop down into that space and the soil will go back. And it can be really, really fast way to plant lots of bulbs. Um, and then with little bulbs, I like a soil knife, which is like a trowel, but just a straight blade and really strong. And you just stick it in the ground. Again, I just lean it forward to make a gap, drop that little crocus or whatever in there, and let it back. And that can be really fast once you kind of get a rhythm to it. Um, and then the other technique that I have is I'm planting intensely in a small area. So my previous garden had like a little bed right up by the front of the driveway, and I put like 200 tulips in like 5 square feet. And that I actually just took a shovel and scooped off the top layer of the soil and put it in a wheelbarrow, set my tulips out on that soil and then dumped the ground back on top of them to fill that in. You can also do if you have access, my city has free compost that the city takes from yard waste, so you can get a load of it for free. If you just do, again, if you're not on the edge of the hardiness, if you can set bulbs right on the soil surface and just dump enough compost and mulch over to cover them, and they'll be just fine most of the time. So if you're having a big area and have really rocky soil, sometimes almost like a mini raised bed, just set them on the soil surface and pile dirt on top of them can be an easy way if you're fighting through really rocky soils. And again, the bulbs, most of them, they're going to be regrowing new bulbs each year, and most bulbs have ways to move themselves. Next year, they'll regrow that new bulb at the depth that they want to be. So they'll settle themselves out over time into the right spot in the soil, as long as you're not worrying about them freezing if they're barely hardy in your conditions.
The other thing that people worry about is squirrels, chipmunks, deer, pests.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the one thing that could foil your 200 tulip bulbs all in one place. The squirrels know, like they'll be eating there for
For
weeks.
sure. Yes.
So what do you do? How do you keep your, big investment from getting eaten?
So there's a few things that I have learned dealing with the squirrels, the voles, the chipmunks, all the rodents. Um, the number one thing, and like this is like the best insurance is to choose things that they can't eat because they're toxic to them. So daffodils, snowdrops, and alliums, the onions, are the great go-tos for pest resistance because they won't eat those. They're toxic to squirrels, and they just leave them alone. So if you know you have just, if you know your neighbors are feeding the squirrels all the time and you have tons of squirrels in your neighborhood, sometimes just saying, crocuses and tulips are by and large really tasty. And if you have tons of squirrels, sometimes it's just easier to say, I'm not going to mess with with the tasty bulbs. Um, There are a few things that I have found to be successful, and some of these I learned when I'm in northern Indiana now, but I my last garden was in coastal Virginia, and we had the most vicious voles known to me. It's a different species of vole than we have in the north, and they eat everything. Literally, you put a host in the ground and they eat all the roots off, and it's just dead and everything. And what I found was really effective in stopping them was a product called Permatil, or sometimes sold as Volblock. And what it is it's a slate stone that's been heated up till it poofs up like popcorn almost. And it's very jagged and sharp. If you touch it with your hands, it feels very harsh on your hands. And if when I plant my bulbs, I surround them with that, that's hard on the paws of the squirrels or the chipmunks or anything that's trying to dig down and get in the bulbs, and it really dissuades them pretty effectively. So if you can find permatil for sale, that's a really great option to just plant the bulbs and just make sure they're surrounded by some of that. And if you can't find that particular product, if you can find a gravel, so not like a round pea gravel, but a gravel that feels jagged and sharp and has sharp edges to it, or like lava rock or something like that, putting that around the bulbs can really dissuade them from digging and getting to those. Um, and then the ultimate protection is a layer of chicken wire over the top. And I have done that, but it's kind of impractical. So you can plant the bulbs and then lay flat on the ground chicken wire over the soil surface and then put mulch on that so it's invisible. And the bulbs will grow up through it, but the squirrels and things can't dig down to get it. It works really, really well. I planted, tulips in my squirrel infested yard and they all came up and none of them got eaten. But then it's kind of, unless you're going to rip, then you have chicken wire in the way. It's a little bit of a pain to then plant anything else. You kind of have to take it out again if you want to plant summer annuals. So that works, but I haven't found it to be particularly practical, in my experience.
That makes sense. One other tip that people sometimes do that, with especially tulips and things that animals really love is containers, like
Yes.
planting into a container in the fall, putting it somewhere where it can get the cold it needs, but that the animals can't get to it. So like maybe an unheated garage. Your neighbor to the south, Irvin Etienne, did an article specifically about this, and he puts them under a pile of mulch, and he puts deer repellent plant skid, which I think is blood based.
Yeah, I think so.
Ugh.
Yeah.
But that apparently that is enough to, the squirrel's like, nope, I don't need to go there, and then you pull that pot out in the
Yeah.
spring. Do you do this, and do you have tips for, timing and how to do the bulbs in containers?
Yeah, I like doing bulbs in containers a lot. I mean, as you said, it can be a way to protect them from pests. Though I weirdly, I have done it. I often do it in an unheated garage or a shed, which is where I like to put them. I find then the mice can become even a bigger problem than the squirrels. So, but in that space, a little mouse trap next to the pots can be effective, or again, some kind of wire, like hardware cloth or something over the top of the pots can help keep them out. I really like doing bulbs in pots because then they become very easy to move around.
Hmm.
Um, because there's a lot of bulbs that are really beautiful in flower, and then they have a long, ugly period as they're going dormant. And so it's really nice to have it in a container. You can put it out on your front porch, and then once it finishes flowering, it can go into the back 40 and finish, and finish its ugly phase. So you really, when you're planting in containers, you can almost do it just like you would in ground. Plant them in the fall like you usually would, and then put them outside for a cold period. And so they do need a period of cold temperatures in order to root and to be forced into come into flower. But you often don't want to expose them to the most extremes because, again, not being buried in the soil, they're not going to be insulated from those extreme temperature variations. Um, so there's a couple things. So you can take Irvin's method, which is bury them in a pile of mulch, which I just don't have space in my yard to have a big
Hmm.
pile of mulch to do that. My preference is in my garage. I have an attached unheated garage, and so it stays cool. It's getting below freezing, but it's not, it's a little insulated from the extremes. Or a garden shed can be a really good place to do it. Or even just, up against the wall of the house, just somewhere if you take all those pots and kind of mass them together so they're providing some insulation around them. Um, and often, even if it's a large container, I've done tulips. I have a pretty big planter that's kind of too hard to move. And I just put tulips in that as is because, the rule of thumb for plants in containers over the winter is to go 2 zones of hardiness colder than you are. So if you're in zone 6, if something is hardy to zone 4, you can usually just put it in a container outside and it'll be fine because it's so cold hardy that even though it's more exposed to those cold temperatures. So there's lots of ways to do it, but really the theme is just to keep them, let them be exposed to cold temperatures, give them a little bit of insulation if you can. Um, and then the only other thing I would say is to be a little careful is with watering them, because when they start growing in the spring, there's sometimes the thing that happens if they're in a garage where the top of the container will thaw out but the bottom will still be frozen. And if you water it, then that water will pool and collect and it can't drain out. And you can let the bulbs, you can drown your bulbs in it. So this is a tip I heard years ago, and I can't remember the gardener's name who said it. They said whenever they put their containers in the garage, they put like a gallon milk jug full of water next to it. And then when the milk jug was completely thawed, that they knew that the pots were also completely thawed. So while there was still some ice in the middle of the jug, there's going to be ice in the pots. And then when that was fully thawed, they knew it was time to start watering. And they had a convenient jug full of water there ready to do to do some watering with.
That's smart. And the pots that you use, they don't have to be decorative necessarily. These can be like the black nursery pots that
Yeah,
you
in
get with
fact,
your
usually,
plants.
yeah, like I use black nursery pots because a lot of the decorative pots may not be able to be freeze tolerant. A lot of the ceramic pots will shatter if they're put outside. What I really like is if you have a nice decorative pot that's just a little bit bigger than a standard nursery pot, then you can just set that nursery pot into it when it's in flower, and then you can keep cycling out. So if maybe you have a pot of crocuses and then daffodils and tulips, you can move them in and out of those decorative pots as they come in and out of bloom. Also, there's a garden designer who they in large containers they sink small pots down in the soil. So like a little quart-sized pot, and they just sink it down in the soil, and then that just becomes a slot that they can drop another pot into. So they can have things permanently planted in the large container, and then they have little spots where they can drop in the crocuses and then pull them out, and then drop in the daffodils, and they can change those things out to really give you a lot of flower display, and then move those away to a less prominent part of the garden when after the leaves are maturing and coming on.
Yes, so that's actually a good segue into another question that we got about the foliage. So that's like you've described that as sort of the big downside of a lot of bulbs is that like after they're done flowering, we really don't want to be looking at them anymore, but we do need to leave that foliage up. So we had a question which was basically, how long? Like, because they're feeling impatient, like, like when can I do it? When's the earliest and like what's the advantage of leaving it longer?
Yeah, so the foliage is really important for bulbs because when you buy that bulb in the fall, it is full of stored food. And in fact, the flower is already preformed inside that bulb. So if you cut open a tulip bulb and look under a microscope, you can see a tulip flower already, the cells are already in there and they're just going to grow and expand. So after they flower, is when they're doing all the growing and photosynthesizing and producing the energy and producing the flowers for next year. So that period when they just have leaves is determining if you're going to get flowers next year, how many flowers you're going to get, if they're going to multiply or not. So that's kind of the most critical period for the bulb in terms of its health and longevity in the garden. So ideally, you want to leave those leaves up until they naturally turn yellow and then you cut them away because as long as they're green, they're going to be photosynthesizing and sending food down into that bulb. And then that last stage, when they're green and turning yellow, the plant is taking the nutrients that are in the leaves themselves and bringing them down into the bulb. So in a perfect world, you want to plant them where they can naturally go yellow the whole way and you don't clear them away, or you maybe never clear them away, honestly, if you don't have to. Um, so I really like for bulbs that have a lot of strappy foliage to try to plant them where something else is going to come up and cover them. I really like ornamental grasses. I really like interplanting with ornamental grasses because a lot of ornamental grasses really don't start growing until a bit later in the season until it gets warm. And so the bulbs look beautiful. And then once the grasses come up, I don't see the bulb foliage. So I really try to be strategic about where I place my bulbs, um, so that I don't see the foliage. Um, Now you can cut them earlier if you want. It's just the earlier you cut them, to cut those leaves off, you're gonna just impede the growth of the bulbs a little bit. If it's something super vigorous that grows like a weed for you, and some daffodils just multiply and flower like crazy, that may be fine. It may be that you can cut the leaves off a little bit earlier, and they'll still have enough energy to carry on and flower next year. But um, I think ideally you want to just let them grow to yellow naturally. Plant them somewhere where they're not going to look ugly. Or, I mean, I've become my favorite varieties of daffodils are ones that have fine textured foliage that's not ugly when it goes as it goes dormant. So some of the the jonquilla varieties have a very narrow, grassy like foliage that just is not nearly as obtrusive while it's going dormant as sort of that big, strappy trumpet daffodil. So that's something, actually going back to the container thing, I increasingly, if I haven't grown a daffodil before, I'll buy like 10 bulbs of it, put it in a container, and then I can look at it through its whole growth cycle and see, oh, this one has fine foliage and doesn't look too bad as it's going dormant. And I can kind of get a better sense of how it's going to perform in my garden because the problem with catalog photos is it's a lot of close-ups of beautiful flowers, and every daffodil has beautiful flowers, but really my favorites are often about how they perform in the garden, how the leaves and the foliage and the flowers go together. So sometimes it can be really fun and informative to just try a bunch of varieties, just get a few of them, grow them in containers and see how, and then you can look at that foliage through its life cycle and figure out where in your garden that foliage is going to work and where it won't.
Okay.
Hi, as a disembodied voice, hello everyone, it's Christine. I wanted to pop in while we were talking about this because I thought Virginia had an interesting question.
Yeah, I was gonna ask that one.
Oh, were you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
No, go. Tell him Virginia's
Okay.
question.
Well, yeah. So Virginia asked, can you dig out the bulbs and lay them in the sun till the leaves turn yellow? Lay them in a box like in the sun, or is that detrimental?
You could, especially if it was right at the end of that life cycle. So when the leaves first come up, they really need to be in the ground so the roots can still be bringing up water and nutrients to those leaves to help them photosynthesize. But for example, if they're just beginning to turn yellow, so say if the tips of the leaves were yellowing and they hadn't yellowed all the way back yet, at that point, it's not so much photosynthesis, it's more the plant just recovering the nutrients in their leaves. So at the very end there, you could dig them out, um, and let them, finish going dormant out of the ground. And I mean, you could, if you're careful to preserve the roots and potted them up in some soil and kept them watered, you probably could move them successfully while they're still in leaf and let them finish photosynthesizing that way. Um, but I think, yeah, it would be a matter of like how it's probably really come down to like if you have a heavy rocky soil and you can't pry the bulbs out without destroying all the roots, that'd be hard. If you have a loose sandy soil, it may be easy to just lift them up and move them into a container to finish going dormant. That's really interesting. I've not heard of that, honestly, but I think it should work, particularly if you're waiting towards the end of the foliage cycle when they're about to go dormant anyway.
But you would say replant them right away, rather than cutting them off and holding them until fall to put them back in?
So you could do either. Honestly, if once they're dormant, the classic bulbs, the tulips, the daffodils and stuff. I mean, that's the bulb companies, the big bulb growers, they're digging them up every year in production. They lift them
Yeah.
up once they're dormant and they're storing them dry in a warehouse and they're planting them again in the fall. So you certainly can do that. And in fact, some if you have a really rainy climate, they might do better that way. So
Mhm.
tulips that tend to be not very perennial in wet climates, they really like a dry summer dormancy. So I think I think like traditionally British tulip growers would dig their bulbs every summer and store them dry because it was so wet in the summer that the tulips that are from Turkey are going to rot in that British rain. So certainly, yeah, if you I often, if I want to move, I have daffodils that are in the wrong place. That's when I would do it. I would dig them up right as they're going dormant when I can still see them, throw them in a box in the basement or whatever, and store them dry over the summer, and then plant them in the fall like I would the rest of my bulbs.
Okay, that's a good pointer. And actually that brings me to a question that we got through social media. They wanted to know, can you plant summer blooming bulbs now in the fall, or when is the time to plant summer blooming bulbs?
So if you live in Florida, or if you live in a very warm climate, you probably could. So the summer bloom bulbs you want to plant in the spring most of the time. So they need most of the time they're going to need warm temperatures, long days, and if you're planting them, and a lot of these bulbs, even if they are hardy in the ground, if you could leave them in the ground year round, if they've been stored dry, as soon as they're put in the moist soil, they're going to be primed to start growing, even though it's fall and it's the wrong time to start growing. So for summer blooming bulbs, you want to wait until the spring, usually past your first frost. And a lot of the popular summer blooming bulbs, the gladiolus and so forth, are not particularly hardy. So most of the times, for us in the north, they're not going to survive our winters anyway. So we want to plant them in the spring and let them grow through that warm summer period. And then you may want to dig them in the fall again if they're not going to be hardy through your winters.
That makes sense. Um, I think timing in general is something that people have questions about. And um, so is there a sort of rule of thumb, like a window for fall blooming bulbs that we should, does it close? Like, you know what I
So
mean? Is it when the ground freezes?
yeah, for fall blooming bulbs, really, for me, the window is pretty much somewhere between your first frost. So you want the soil to have gotten a little bit cooler, and then pretty much as long as you can keep digging. So so certainly for us in the north where the ground is going to freeze solid, frozen ground is that hard cutoff because it's physically impossible to plant bulbs after that point. If you're in a more southern climate, say like zone 7 or south where the ground isn't going to freeze solid, there the concern is more giving them enough chilling periods. So the bulbs need a period of cool temperatures to know that winter happened so that they're going to wait to come back to spring. So if you're in a mild winter, you could, in theory, you can get them in the ground all winter, but they're not going to have enough chilling. So for me, I would say sometimes between frost and like New Year's is probably the hard cutoff for giving them enough. And for those of us in the north, usually, you want to get it in before it starts snowing and you can, or the ground is frozen and you can't. But the bulbs are way more resilient often than we give them credit for. And certainly if you think you've missed the window, one thing you can do is then store them in a refrigerator and plant them as soon as you can in the spring. So in the very deep south where they don't have cool winters, that's how people grow tulips. They pre-chill them, they store them in a refrigerator, and then you plant them outside as you're giving them artificial winter. So if you found that bag of tulips you totally forgot about, it's Christmas, the ground is covered in snow, the ground is frozen. Put that in a refrigerator, and then as soon as you can plant it in the spring, get them in the ground, and they'll often come through just fine and still flower and perform. They're tough, and usually if you can get them in the ground, they'll flower, they'll survive, is my experience.
Excellent, excellent. Um, We had a question about someone who has a natural native garden, like dogwoods, tiarellas, and ferns. They wanted to know if there are any spring bulbs that would be a good companion in that type of a setting. And something I don't think we've mentioned is that most spring flowering bulbs need full sun, but I think they're looking for something that can take some shade.
Yeah. So the classic spring flowering bulbs that we think of, the tulips, the daffodils, crocuses, are mostly from areas in like Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, Turkey, and they are native to very hot climates that are very hot and dry and sunny in the summer. And that's why they go dormant, is there's no rain in the summer, so they lose all their leaves and they wait out the dry summer and the cold winter so they can just grow excuse me, in the spring when the rains come. But there are a whole other group of, bulbs, many of them are not true bulbs, that are native to woodlands. And so a lot of our native woodland wildflowers are also are geophytes or some form of bulb or rhizome and will come up in the spring and go dormant in a woodland setting because once the trees leaf out, there's not enough light for photosynthesis. So if you have native bulbs, so native trilliums, Virginia bluebells, Dutchman's britches, there's so many really wonderful native, bulbs in quotes, and they're not true bulbs that are really perfectly, native plants, really well adapted to shade, deciduous shade, any tree that's going to drop its leaves, and are going to look so beautiful and natural with your native plant garden. They're also a really important thing to include because often these early spring blooming natives are the first food source for pollinators that are coming out of hibernation. So all our bumblebees, for example, the whole hive dies off, and the only thing that overwinters is the queen. So the new queens hibernate through the winter, and when they come out in the spring, they have to get some food and rear out their first brood of workers all by themselves. And those early spring bloomers, the trilliums, the Dutchman's britches, the trout lilies, are that critical food source for our native bumblebees. So adding those to the garden they're beautiful, beautiful plants. And they're also a really great, support for our native pollinators.
Very cool. And I wanted to point out to the participants that Christine has dropped a link to the article that you wrote into the chat, and that includes a sidebar on some of these spring flowering ephemerals that
Yeah.
would be great in that woodland setting.
Oh, the only thing I would say is if you're trying to like transition from a more formal garden to the natural garden and you want to find something that's sort of in the in between in a sunnier spot, smaller flower daffodils often look much more natural. Some of the really large flower daffodils look a little bit weird in a more wild garden, but any of the forms that have the smaller flowers or the multi-flowered ones, I think really give you that little naturalistic, more informal look if you're trying to transition to the woodlands from your sort of more formal cultivated gardens.
Yeah, that's a great tip. I wanted to ask Christine if you have any questions that have come in since we started recording.
I do. I have a few that would be good to discuss. I think, Joseph, you may have kind of touched on this in one of your answers, but just to discuss maybe more directly, how important is spacing when you're planting bulbs?
Yeah, so spacing I think is way less important with bulbs than with most perennials. So the certainly most bulbs, most perennials, they are growing pretty wide. Most bulbs are pretty skinny. They're a pretty narrow form in the garden. And the spacing recommendations you'll see in catalogs are often more, I would take them more as a minimum than a maximum, if that makes sense. So if they're saying so many per square feet, that's the minimum that's going to give you a nice full looking carpet of blooms in that space. But most bulbs, once they divide, will form a big mass of bulbs growing quite close together. And as long as they have full sun and as long as they have, adequate nutrition, they'll keep blooming usually when they're growing very closely together. So I have certainly in areas where I'm trying to make a big impact in a small area, I have planted literally tulips touching each other, place the bulbs right next to each other. It takes a lot of bulbs to do that. And often with daffodils, I want to space them more widely and let them multiply to fill in that space. but you can really smash them quite close together. Um, and even in containers or spaces where it's going to be more of an annual display, tulips often we use sort of as an annual. We plant them and then we're going to pull them out and replace them with annuals or something. You can even put them on top of each other. You can I did this in a container. I put a layer of tulips literally touching each other and then another layer on top of that, sort of in between the noses of those tulips. And then when they bloom, it was just this mass of flowers just packed in there. So, um, in areas where you want them to let naturalize or you're trying to save money, you can take things that are going to multiply like daffodils and crocuses and space them out more widely and let them fill in that area over time. And if you really want to make a big display in a small space, you can really jam them in there and if you really want that wow factor for maybe, right by the front walk or a container or somewhere where you really want to, pump up the impact of that.
That'd be a good place to do your the chicken wire.
Yes,
If
yes, for
I'm
sure.
investing that many hundreds of
Yes, and
dollars.
that's like often those high profile places like tulips often if you're somewhere where tulips are not very perennial anyway, as soon as they finish flowering, you may just want to pull them out and plant annuals there. And so then you could just do the chicken wire and then pull the whole thing out and put in your petunias or whatever you want to do through the summer, and have that, more intensively cultivated thing that's really protected from the hungry squirrels. Because yeah, that'd be pretty devastating to put all those tulips in. And then I had that one of my first gardens. I planted all these tulips, and the neighbors had a black walnut tree. And in the spring, all my tulips, the squirrels had eaten all the tulips and buried all the black walnuts. So I just had black walnut seedlings coming up where I wanted my tulips.
Oh,
It was
that's a double,
heartbreaking. Yeah.
double sad. We had a question that came in before the podcast or before the webinar about trustworthy and lovely tulips and favorite colors. Do you have favorite tulips that you would share with us?
My longtime favorite is a variety called Princess Irene, which is an orange tulip. It's so gaudy, but it's an orange tulip that kind of almost has a purple flame, they call it, a purple stripe almost up the sides of it. And it's so bright and so colorful that I really, really love Princess Irene. Another longtime favorite of mine is a variety called Ballerina, which is one of the lily flower tulips that have this kind of the petals kind of curve in and out again on the flower. Again, it's a bright orange. I love an orange tulip. I don't know why. But ballerina has also been one of the most perennial varieties of tulips that I've grown. So it's persisted really well, especially if it's really dry in the summer. So I have a big sugar maple. And on the south side of that sugar maple, it's full sun, but it's full of maple roots, so it's bone dry. And that's where like my tulips really want to perennialize because it stays nice and dry in the summer when they're dormant.
Yes. Somebody just asked if is Princess Irene fragrant?
A little bit. I
Yeah.
feel like tulips sometimes have a fragrance. And it's sort of like if I stick my nose in, I'd like, oh, there's a little bit. I've never find tulip fragrance particularly, um, and to my nose anyways, fragrance is really subjective, very notable. So it does have a little bit of scent. Maybe you notice it in a bouquet or something. You cut it in the vase. I've never really noticed it much in the garden. For scent, I mean, hyacinths are the short answer for great fragrance, from the bulbs.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Let me see. We, do you have any questions, Christine? Do we have
We
any
have
more
ton
that
I
have
mean,
come
yeah, we
in?
have tons of
I
questions to go
figured, yeah.
through. The one of the ones kind of jumping off of that, what we're just talking about when you can really crowd bulbs in is that Steve says that once the bulbs have reproduced and they are getting crowded, so he has found that sometimes they don't all flower. So when digging up, and if you want to thin them out, how would you store the excess and how long can they be stored? Is there kind of a trick to making sure everybody is, going to remain viable?
Yeah, so some bulbs will, again, usually if they're in full sun and you're giving plenty of fertility, most bulbs will continue blooming even when they're really congested. So more often, so there are some daffodil varieties that really will choke themselves out, and you do need to divide them, but I would say most of the time when I've had people say, "Oh, my plants need divided, they aren't flowering anymore." The problem often is the shade tree has grown out more than they realize and is shading them out. But certainly, I like to. You can dig them up and divide them anytime when they're dormant is fine, but when the leaves aren't there, it's really hard to find them. So my go-to time if I want to divide or move my bulbs is to do it right as the leaves have turned yellow, but they're still attached, so I can easily find the bulbs. And then again, like we're saying, once they're dug up, the classic bulbs, and that doesn't apply for like our native woodland plants, but the classic tulips, etc., they can be stored just fine dry. So my go-to is to dig them up, clean off the soil, separate the bulbs, and then store them usually in my basement, just in a cardboard box or bag where they're going to stay dry through the summer and then plant them in the fall. And then as terms of viability of stuff you've dug up, as long as it feels firm, if it gets mushy, you want to throw it away. Anything that feels mushy or soft is going to be is rot. You want to get rid of that quickly so it doesn't spread. But any bulb that feels firm, and if you have a lot of them, you may want to sort out the biggest ones. The smallest ones will eventually bulk up and flower, but if there's some really small bulbs in there, it may not be worth, and you have a ton of big ones, it may not be worth replanting the little ones and then waiting 3 years for them to get up to blooming size. So in some plants that, that multiply a lot, I'll throw away the smaller ones and just replant the biggest, chunkiest bulbs in the garden. And then if you have extras, this is one of the joys of gardening to me is giving plants away. I love, we have a neighborhood group in my community where people, oh, I have an extra this, and they share things, and it's really fun to dig up your big clumps of daffodils and have hundreds of them, be able to give them away to people so they can enjoy them in the gardens.
That's great. I love my local garden group, and I would recommend to anybody that's where you're going to find your people. Yeah. We had a question from somebody about how do you choose a color palette? Like they for example have a cafe au lait, cream beige cafe au lait historic house, and they're trying to figure out a good color palette. How do you get ideas and inspiration for color?
So I'm not sure if I'm the best person or the worst person to ask this question. Um, because I'm not naturally a great designer, but I think that's actually a strength because sometimes when I ask people who are really great garden designers, excuse me, they say things like, well, just play with the colors until it looks good. And it's like, but I don't know, I don't know what looks good. Um, but I've found a couple things for myself who's not like naturally good at garden design. The first rule that I've learned is to limit my color palette. To pick just like one or two colors is a simple way to make it look really great. So if you have all the colors, it can be really hard to make it not look chaotic. But if you just pick, I'm just going to do purples and reds, or yellows and whites, or oranges and reds, or maybe just a couple colors is a real shortcut to making it look really intentional and harmonious. The other thing that I found really useful, and this is something I picked up when Fine Gardening has an online course on garden design that Courtney Olander did, and I worked behind the scenes with her a little bit in editing and developing that. And she's one of these great designers who's good at explaining. And one of the tips that she had that I found really useful is sort of training your eye. So whenever I'm visiting gardens, whether it's a public garden or I'm just walking through a neighborhood and I see something that looks great, I try to stop and say, why do I like it? Why do I like this color? Is it the colors? Is it the textures? To really stop and not just say, oh, that's beautiful, but to stop and try to think about why that's appealing to me. So with your house, specific house color, I would really recommend driving around neighborhoods and looking for other houses that are that color. And right now, it's not going to be bulbs, but they maybe have mums or annuals or perennials flowering, and look and see, oh, that one looks great. And see, well, what colors are they using? To go out in the world and see it and really and try to say, oh, that one I don't like as much, and then stop to ask, oh, well, is it because the yellow flowers kind of blend into the tan or but I think everybody has really different tastes, but I do think it's something I always thought, oh, I just don't have a great eye for design, but I have learned that I can train myself by being more aware and looking, and then asking myself, why does this work? And then the final tip I would have is to like print out a picture of your house in color and then get a bulb catalog and cut out the pictures of bulbs. And then you can literally set them there. Sometimes it's really hard to visualize what this is going to look like and say, okay, I'm thinking maybe a yellow orange color palette look great, or maybe I want like darks, reds and purples and blues. And literally just cut out the pictures and you can set them there and get that visual sense of, does this let this look good to me or not? And that can be a great way to sort of make it less abstract and try it. And then my final tip would be, again, to play with containers. So before you commit to, I'm a big advocate for large numbers of bulbs. I think 200 daffodils makes a big statement. But if you're not sure what colors you want, this year just buy a few bags of different things and then put them in containers. And then you can set them out in front of your house and try out different color schemes. You can try out, you know, deep red tulips and purple alliums or yellow and white daffodils and literally just set them there and say, oh, I like this or I don't like that. And then you have a chance to try the different things and play with it before you commit to, I'm going to do the whole front yard in purple and that's going to be still dramatic and perfect.
I think, by the way, I think that would be dramatic and perfect.
I think so
I'm a
too.
purple person.
Yeah, I think dark colors against light houses often looks really cool. So yeah, that would be, I would think if you have a really light tan cream house, like a bunch of purples and some reds would probably look really dramatic. But whites
But
and
white,
yellows,
yeah, white is
white
also a
might look
color.
so soothing and calm. Like high contrast is sometimes higher energy, and similar colors might feel calm and restful. So again, it's a judgment call. There's not like a right answer. So I'm really an advocate for playing around with it and seeing what you actually makes you feel, go, that's perfect.
Yes, yes, like a vision board kind
Yeah,
of,
for sure. Yeah, yeah.
idea. And this is a
And
great time to be doing that too.
and I think also you don't have to rush it. I think sometimes I feel like, you know, you can take a couple years and play with stuff before you don't have to have the final vision right now because you're going to be in the house for a while probably. So you can take time to figure out what really works for you.
Very
But
cool.
Joseph doesn't know
Christine?
anything. Yeah, but Joseph doesn't know anything about design, guys. He's not the design guy. And yet he has amazing, those were amazing tips. I just wanted to
Well,
say.
that's why I say I feel like
Yes.
because doesn't come naturally to me, I've had to think about it more. Some people are great designers just instinctively, and they're like, "Well, just use colors that look good." And it's like, what does that mean?
Well, I was teasing you, but I thought that was excellent advice.
Absolutely.
I
And I do think you're a great designer, by the
Oh,
way.
well,
yeah.
thank you. I appreciate that.
Um, I'd have more questions, but I don't know if you have more you want to get through, Carol. We are about maybe like
Yeah, let's take them from the chat because I think we've gotten through most of the ones we got in advance.
okay. All right. Well, so Pat had a question from the chat is about fritillaria, the
Mhm.
best way to grow and regrow. They're having trouble, particularly with the imperial variety. And yeah, I just wanted to get, we hadn't, I don't think, talked much about fritillarias. Just curious what your
Yeah.
thoughts were.
Fritillarias
We
are.
we did talk about it on the podcast
Oh,
episode,
right.
which
Yes.
is going to go live on the 26th. So, but you can let's
The,
cover it again
Yeah,
here.
the short answer on Fritillaria imperialis is it needs perfect drainage. They come from a very like Central Asia, very dry climate. So if you live in like Denver, they're going to be so happy. If you live somewhere where you're getting more than 14 inches of rain a year, you really want to think about if they're sitting in wet soils, they will rot and they will not persist. So if you have heavy clay, this is where I like growing a lot of alpine plants that need good drainage and on hardy cactus is build up a raised bed with sand. So if you can have the bulb sitting above your wet soil in sandy soil, that'll be the conditions that they need. But they need full sun, but then really a lot of people fail with them just because they need really perfect drainage. If you have a wet clay soil, you're going to need to build up some kind of raised soil to keep them from rotting out.
And the other thing that we talked about on the podcast episode was that there are just a certain number of crown imperials that don't flower. They don't flower,
Yeah.
and that's nothing that you did. It just happens.
Yeah. Yeah, it can, they're so beautiful, but they can be a little bit of a finicky, which is one of those things that's very satisfying. So it's one of those things, if you are sitting there saying, I have such dry, sandy soil and I can't keep everything watered, then this is go buy a bunch of crown imperials and they'll be gorgeous, and everyone else who has wet soils will be so jealous. Like lean, if you have dry, droughty soils, lean into the plants that love that and accept that, yeah, no, everything's gonna thrive all the time.
Yes, and the upside is that they're stinky, so the deer and the rabbits and everybody,
Yeah.
the squirrels, leave them alone. So
If they're
that's
well suited to your conditions, yeah, they're very pest resistant, and they're very they're very sturdy when they're happy. But they can, yeah. So if you have the right conditions, they're a wonderful, wonderful plant.
absolutely. Any other questions from the chat,
Uh,
Christine?
Yeah, so Jennifer was asking that, or mentioning that she's already getting bulbs delivered she's in, I think, Minnesota. Is it too early to plant? When is too early to plant?
So again, I'm not very fussy about this because often I plant when I have time in my schedule. So if usually they come early, I do often plant early. Ideally, you want to wait until you've gotten around first frost, until the soil temperature has cooled down a little bit. Um, but it really is not that critical. So if you had them, if if I got one right now, I would probably put it in somewhere cool and dry, like a basement where it's going to stay cooler, and leave it until we get to frosty weather. But certainly, if you're saying, I have free time this weekend and I don't know when I will again, go ahead and plant them, and they'll probably be just fine. I don't think the timing on the fall planting is really that critical, honestly, for most of these things.
Great. Okay. Have you ever used an auger for planting?
I have, and it worked. It works beautifully on my current garden where I have a very light sandy soil, and it's just magic. They just go boom, boom, boom. When I had heavy clay soil, it was not at all. And if you're planting where there's tree roots, it's a nightmare because the roots just wrap around the auger. So, um, if you have a pretty light soil and you have somewhere that doesn't have a lot of roots in it, it can be a really magical way to rapidly plant a lot of bulbs. But if you're planting in tree roots, or if you have a lot of other perennials and stuff you're trying to plant between, it can be, I find a little not practical depending on the situation. But a new bed with nothing in it and light soil, it can be a really fast way to plant a lot of bulbs.
Something that you mentioned in the article was that light fluffed up soil makes it way easier for the squirrels to find it. So if you're using the bulb auger, you might want to be doing daffodils or something that the
Yes,
squirrels
yes,
don't
for
like.
sure. And that's also one of those things. Often, if you can get through that first year with bulbs, the squirrel pressure is way worse. When you've just planted them, that loose soil really invites them to come and dig them all up and eat them all. But sometimes I've seen, like, it's like I plant daffodils and they all get eaten, but my neighbors, I mean, tulips, and they all get eaten, but my neighbors have tulips that have been there for 3 years and they're just fine because the older plantings, the new plantings often are more attractive to the squirrels, unfortunately.
I have gotten tulips to come through the winter, and then the deer just come and take the tops
Yeah,
right off, and it's you weep and you shake your fist, but like should we be putting deer spray on our
you certainly can. I mean, I've gardened with a lot of deer, and I've always come to the only real solution to deer is a big, solid, tall fence. The sprays are so tedious to keep reapplying and reapplying to try to protect them if you have high deer pressure, and the deer will eventually get used to them.
yeah.
I've seen this happen many times. The deer, it's not poisonous, it just tastes bad. And if the deer are hungry enough, eventually they'll munch on the tulip even though it tastes bad. And once they realize, oh, this tastes bad, but it's actually not harmful, then it just stops working and you can spray all day and they still eat. So I really think the repellent sprays are like a temporary thing till you get your fence up. But if you have high deer pressure, it's like you'll wind up spending more on repellents with less success and replacing plants. So I would say, I'm in town right now and I don't have deer, and it's the best thing ever. But if I moved again to a place with high deer pressure, my first investment would be a solid fence, or I'm just not going to plant anything. I'm just going to plant daffodils and forget the tulips because it's just too heartbreaking to keep having the deer eat
Yes.
everything over and over again.
Yes. We're coming down to the end. Christine, do we have any more questions from the chat that we'd like to get to?
Um, we do, of course, but I saying, you know, I I'm gonna do this one because I'm personally curious about it. So I know for a lot of gardens and gardeners, people will plant crocus and in their lawns, and we were kind of discussing that crocus can be difficult to kind of manage, especially with pressure from, like you're saying, wildlife. But what other, I think you've done some posts or articles about bulb lawns. I was curious what other bulbs might lend themselves to sort of a bulb lawn.
Yeah, bulb lawns are really fun. But they're sometimes I think the less you mow your grass, the better your bulb lawn can be. So really, again, we're talking about we need to leave those leaves up while they're still green. So if you start mowing your grass before the bulbs have turned yellow, you're going to cut off those leaves and they're really going to suffer. So the best bulbs for a lawn are usually the ones that come up really early and then of course go dormant really early. So the little scillas like Scilla siberica is one of the best for naturalizing in lawns. Crocuses can do pretty good, especially if you're going to wait a little bit longer to start mowing. But things like daffodils, it's pretty impossible to really get to naturalize in the lawn unless it's going to be a very rough area that you're not going to mow well into the summer when they've started going dormant. Um, the other interesting option with bulb lawns, and I've seen this be really successful, if you're in somewhere with a drier climate and they're using some of these sort of drought tolerant like buffalo grass and some of these other sort of lawn alternatives that are not the traditional um, bluegrass that takes a lot of water and starts growing really early. I've seen some lawns, like again in Denver, where they use a native buffalo grass that doesn't start growing pretty late in the summer because it's a warm season grass. So it really suits itself really well to bulbs growing in those types of native those sort of water-wise lawns. Or if you're doing sort of sedges as lawn alternatives have become really trendy. And sedges are great because a lot of them don't get very tall and you can get away without mowing them or just mowing them once in the summer. And those are going to be way easier to integrate bulbs into than a really traditional bluegrass lawn that you water and fertilize and starts growing right in the spring and it's going to just become too hard to manage, letting the bulb leaves mature in it. The other bulb that can do pretty well in lawns are the grape hyacinths, muscari, because they actually put up their leaves in the fall. Mine are already putting up their foliage. So if you're able to stop mowing in the fall, they can have their leaves up pretty much through the winter, especially if you don't have a lot of snow cover. They can photosynthesize through a lot of the winter when you're not really mowing the lawn and then come through, and then go dormant once you start mowing again.
Totally makes sense. We had a last minute question I saw pop up on the screen that somebody's planting camasias for the first time and was wondering if you had any tips about that.
Camasias are beautiful and they're a North American native. So a lot of these bulbs we're talking about are European, they're North American native. Camasias are really beautiful. Um, one of the great things about them is they're one of the few bulbs that really does like wet soils. So if you
Mhm.
have wet, soggy soils and your daffodils are rotting out, camasias are a great option for like even almost boggy areas. So it's a great thing. They're so beautiful. The only other thing is, that they're tasty to a lot of things. So certainly be prepared, as with everything, to sort of, if you have high squirrel pressure, prepared to try to fend them off as they're eating them.
Yeah, the colors are
It's the
amazing, just
beautiful, beautiful,
beautiful.
beautiful great blues. And they're really, I think they look so beautiful with tulips because they do those blues that tulips don't. And they look a
Mhm.
beautiful combination with some of those reds and yellows and stuff.
Well, I think we are coming down to the end of it. I want to put in a plug for the Fine Gardening podcast, which Joseph is our guest for the September episode. And like I mentioned, that's going to be coming out on the 26th. Like, subscribe, and follow. It's a sort of a plant discovery podcast. I want to thank you so much, Joseph, for your expertise and for the great article. And I would encourage everyone to check out that article for more information about growing bulbs. And somebody is asking, where can we find the video? Christine, can you answer?
Yeah, so I will download the video once it's ready, and I'll upload it back to our website as well as YouTube, and that should be done in the next couple of days. So I believe there's an email that will go out tomorrow, and I'll drop the link to that video into that. And there will also be a survey actually in that email where you can let us know how we did, and if you have any ideas for other topics you might like us to cover in the future, we'd love to hear your feedback.
Absolutely. But thank you, everybody. Thanks again, Joseph, and thank you, Christine.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was so fun.